I would first start with introducing our moderator, who would then explain the structure of the panel and our distinguished guests. And we also have a special address by Ambassador today, who has graciously agreed to come to MIT. So our moderator, Ranjana Khanna, is Deputy Secretary General of FICCI, which is a Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And she has over 3 decades of a distinguished career with extensive experience in both public and private sectors in India. And before she was heading the FICCI in the US, she was a senior director handling America's tourism, civil aviation, corporate communications, and special projects at the FICCI headquarters at Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to invite our moderator to give an overview of the panel and invite Ambassador.
Thank you, Vishnu. It is indeed gratifying to see that diaspora is an important element of this India conference, because the importance of diaspora in the US fabric is something we need to all accept and see where what we are getting at. It's a privilege to have a distinguished panel with us. I would like to invite Ambassador Arun Singh, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission in the Embassy in Washington, to lead with a special address. Ambassador Arun Singh joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1979, and he is a master in economics from Delhi University. We've had economists yesterday, and we're ending up with the economists today. He served in the Indian missions in Moscow, Addis Ababa, Tokyo, back to Moscow. He's headed some very special assignments covering Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and India in the Ministry of External Affairs. Prior to coming to the embassy in Washington, he was India's ambassador in Israel, another very important portfolio. And we've been lucky enough to have him in Washington, D.C. since October 9, 2008. Ambassador Singh.
Thank you, Ranjana ji. I think it's a challenge to speak after that session on spirituality and to discuss about more mundane things. But it's a privilege for me to be with this very, very distinguished panel, all very accomplished people, and fortunately all very good friends of mine. So they will ignore if I say something that they don't agree with. I also want to congratulate the organizers of this conference. I've been here last couple of hours, and the energy and the interest that I noticed in the conference, the level of discussion, is something that all of you deservedly should be proud of. I've been asked to speak for 15 minutes, and so I'll keep to the time. And what I will do is divide my comments in 4 broad segments. I'll speak a little about trends in India-US relations. In the context of those trends, what are the characteristics of the Indian diaspora in the US? Given those characteristics, what is the role that the diaspora is playing or could potentially play in the evolving India-US relationship? And in that background, what are the special facilities that the government of India is offering for enhancing the diaspora engagement? Now, in terms of the India-US relationship, trade has reached a level of $100 billion. It has grown 4 times in the last 8 years. US is now India's largest trading partner. But what is interesting is that trade in services is a very significant portion of this trade. $40 billion of our trade is trade in services. And the trade is a broadly balanced trade relationship, despite some of the criticism that you may hear from time to time about so-called outsourcing. Going beyond the trade relationship are investment flows. US remains among the largest foreign investors in India, both in terms of FDI and in terms of the flows into the stock market. But in the last 5 years, Indian companies have invested $30 billion in the US economy. India has today emerged as among the fastest growing investors in the US economy, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs across 42 states in this country. And just a quick aside, in terms of the potential for all of you from that, Just outside, I introduced a representative, and I'm not going to mention names, of a private sector company to one of the students here. And he was immediately offered a job when he completed his studies at this institution. But in terms of the investment flows and the spread across this country, what has become a defining feature that looking ahead, the India-US partnership would be a partnership based on technology and innovation, because that would be the way to consolidate it. And the reason for it is that a certain amount of niche R&D and development work is taking place in India. Given our particular factor endowments, where we are relatively scarce in terms of capital, less scarce in terms of skilled, technically qualified manpower, certain kinds of R&D and development approaches that happen in India do not happen in Western societies. Now, for example, when I was in Israel, I found that CEOs of most major technology companies in Israel, they used to say that their presence in India, for many of them, had become larger than their presence in Israel, because they felt that to remain globally competitive, and not just with an eye on the Indian market, they needed to do a certain amount of R&D and development work in India. If you look at US companies, many of them follow a similar approach. A router that Cisco has developed in India has now become the fastest selling item in the United States. General Electric has developed a mobile ECG unit, given the fact that in India, access to healthcare facilities are difficult. And based on that development, they're now marketing this product in Africa and Latin America. Similarly, US companies with the same compulsion to try and reach the bottom of the pyramid or the middle of the pyramid are developing products that are suited to other developing countries or suited to less developed sections of society in this country. President Obama, for instance, when he went to India in 2010, had a special meeting with 21 representatives of US and Indian businesses who are partnering with each other in innovation for green technology, for fuel-efficient cars, for water filtration systems, and similar products. Keeping this in mind, both governments are consciously promoting cooperation for innovation. We have set up a joint center for clean energy research. Each government has contributed $25 million. Consortia partners on each side have to contribute another $25 million each. So it's a $100 million fund with which we have started. And this year in June, the first award for projects were done for Indian and US entities coming together to do joint research in solar energy, advanced biofuels, and energy-efficient buildings. So this work has now started. Similarly, to promote science and technology cooperation, we have set up a $30 million fund, equal contribution by both countries, to award joint Indian and US projects. And the first awards have been done in the area of healthy individual and empowering citizens through bridging the digital divide. So this, again, is an example of where the two governments are coming together to promote collaborative research, where there will be opportunities for people of the Indian diaspora in this country and people like you. Another very important area with great potential is education. We have 100,000 Indian students in this country, again, people like you. For these 100,000 students, the government and the people of India are transferring $3 billion annually as tuition fees to US educational institutions. It's a frightening figure, but you multiply 100,000 by 30,000, the average fees, you get a figure of $3 billion. Given this, and the fact that in India, only 10% of people have access to higher education, and the government has plans to take this figure to 20% within the next 10 years, for which we need to build hundreds of new universities, tens of thousands of new colleges. There is going to be a major expansion in the education sector, major requirement for new teachers, educators, and the government has identified US institutions, universities, because of their excellence, because of their experience, as very important partners in this process. And I believe, for instance, that the Indian diaspora in the US has 78,000 people who have PhDs. So again, you can see the potential that there is as we expand education sector in India and cooperation between India and the United States in this field. Going from here briefly to the characteristics of the Indian diaspora here. As you know, the figure is now believed to be about 3 million Indian Americans in this country, 60,000 Indian doctors working all over this country, even in remote areas, providing service to society. 40% of all hotel rooms in the United States are now owned and managed by Indian Americans. If you look at median incomes, the highest median income now amongst any ethnic group is in the Indian American community. If you look at the level of degrees earned, latest research of Pew Center has found that for US as a whole, 30% of Americans have college degrees and higher in the relevant age bracket. For Asian Americans, the figure is 50%. For Indian Americans, the figure is 70%. So again, given this, the opportunity and potential for partnership and cooperation between the two countries suggests itself. The diaspora has involved itself in several areas of cooperation. Recently, for example, I spoke to you about the hotel industry. I met a young hotelier who was born here, grew up in this country, and is building hotels in India. He told me that his father had come from India to the US, had no experience in hotels, now owns 20 hotels, is doing very well here. Based on his father's experience and capacities, this gentleman is building hotels in India, and we are very short of hotels in India. And he said, my father lived out his American dream. I am living out my Indian dream. We find people, for example, involving themselves in distance education. There's the example of people not only doing partnership in innovation, but also in terms of social entrepreneurship. Some people have gone back and set up an ambulance facility, which, and again, as you know, in India, that service, there are tremendous scarcities, where the poor don't pay and the rich have to pay when they use that ambulance service. And they have a very simple way of deciding who is poor and who is rich. If you call the ambulance and you go to a government hospital, you don't pay. If you call the ambulance, you go to a private hospital, you pay. Similarly, you must have heard of the eye care facility, which provides top-of-the-line free cataract eye surgery, and it's self-sustaining based on its earnings. You pay higher if you ask for air-conditioned accommodation and exclusive accommodation, and you don't pay if you opt for non-air-conditioned dormitory accommodation. Again, a way of cross-subsidization, but yet to make the institution self-sustaining. People have involved themselves in philanthropic activities, supporting schemes for teaching students, providing support to schools and other educational institutions, supporting midday meal and nutritional schemes. And of course, there is the overall scope for participation in the higher education sector. Keeping these opportunities in mind, the government of India has given special facilities and schemes for non-resident Indians or people also of Indian origin. One is, of course, we have something called the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, which happens in January every year when the diaspora from all over the world is invited to go to India for 2 or 3 days, and they have sort of interaction there with the top leadership of India. They discuss issues that are relevant to them, and then some of them look for opportunities for economic engagement in India. We have the Overseas Citizenship of India scheme. Under this scheme, anybody who now has a foreign passport but has been of Indian origin can get the OCI, or the Overseas Citizen of India card, which is valid for life. Once somebody has that, they don't need a visa to go to India. Normally, if you have a visa and you go to India and if you stay more than 180 days, you have to register with the police. With this card, you don't need to do that. With this card, you don't need a visa of employment. You can go and work in India. So somebody who has this card has all the facilities that any Indian national has, except, of course, that they can't vote in Indian elections. They can't hold agricultural property. They can't hold plantation property. But other than that, they have all the other privileges. We have also looked at specific partnerships with particularly professional groupings. For example, the API, the American Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, they are running schemes along with the government for healthcare provision in India. The Center for Advanced Study of India at UPenn has been granted some funds to do a research program on the Indian diaspora in the US. And some of the figures that I mentioned to you are a product of that research. We have also set up something called the Diaspora Knowledge Network, which is a portal run by the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs, where people who have scientific and other talents and experience can post their qualifications, achievements, and interests on that. And those who want to avail of those facilities or want to interact, build partnerships, can also do it through this portal. So let me stop here. I thought I'll just give a brief overview of the trends as we see in the India-US relationship and the potential that there is for a deeper diaspora engagement with that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. Now we have the privilege of having a very distinguished panel with us. And without much ado, I'm going to ask Sonal Shah to lead off, make an opening statement about the diaspora and in the corporate sector, with all three of you coming in with your corporate sector backgrounds from the diaspora. Please introduce yourself first.
Sure. My name is Sonal Shah. I'm currently a fellow at Harvard University at the Institute of Politics. And prior to this, I was working at the White House, running an office on social innovation and civic participation, largely looking at how to invest in the social sector and also innovation in the social sector and how to leverage technology to allow for greater citizen participation in government. Before that, I worked at Google in its philanthropic arm, working on developing transparency, openness technologies, mostly in East Africa and India. And before that at Goldman Sachs, and then was also back in the government in the Clinton administration, where I worked at the Treasury Department. So background, I'm an economist. And probably the most accomplished of all of those things is that my siblings and I started a nonprofit 10 years ago called IndyCorps, which was to take Indian Americans or people of Indian origin from around the world and bring them to India to work on service projects. So develop your connection through India through service. And that is probably, of all the accomplishments, I'd say that's probably my biggest one. But the important piece of, I think, the diaspora involvement, and I think we'll talk about this more on the panel, is that we're involved in the US in so many different levels, whether it's at the political level, whether it's at education and healthcare, in government, in small businesses, energy, journalism, politics. There's so many ways that we have integrated into the society, corporate sector, into society in the US, that it's hard to say that one is more successful than the other, because we're actually, I think, growing in very different ways, and as generations, and the longer we've been in the US, the more we integrate into the society here. Vice versa, the connection with India continues in a variety of different ways, from everything from the social to the political to the economic to the corporate. And all of those same things that I mentioned apply reverse also. In many ways, these connections are both. So I think we'll talk about each of these integrations and different ways that we have integrated into this. But I'd say, I think, one of the most important, at least from my perspective and in the perspective that I come from, is both on the corporate innovation side, but also on the social and political side, how we've integrated, I think, has actually been a pretty important aspect of that.
Thank you, Sonal. Now I'll ask Victor Menezes.
I'm Victor Menezes. Great to be back. I was a graduate of Sloan School. I was here 40 years ago. I turned up on this place. This building didn't exist. And you actually had to go to New York for Indian groceries in a place called Kalustian. So it just shows you how much the organization, how much diaspora has grown. I'm normally a good speaker, but I'm tongue-tied today in the presence of Nadir Godrej, who made this wonderful speech in poems. And I can never compete with Nadir Godrej because he's both erudite and non-veg. He gave us great views on mixed economic news and poetically enhanced our knowledge. That's the extent of my poetry. And like Moliere's character, I'm thrilled to be able to speak in prose. The problem about discussing the diaspora, it's like Lake Wobegon, where everybody is above average. And the reality, I think, is we have an incredibly successful diaspora, but it's the mean that's doing very well. And I think there's a significant barbell between the extremely wealthy and the extremely not well off. And we often lose sight of that. And I think while we should celebrate the diaspora, who've done remarkable things, we mustn't forget the fact that there is a significant portion of people who are really struggling to get by, who do not have the same educational opportunities, and are living in effect, ghettos in many cities around the world, around the US. So that's one issue. Another issue is that actually, while we've grown in numbers, the political clout of the community as a whole, I think, is also limited by a strange fate of geography. There's significant preponderance of Democrats in the diaspora. That's just a fact. But the diaspora is concentrated in places like New York, New Jersey, in California, et cetera, which are not the swing states. And therefore, our political clout, we're punching well under our weight. Now, of course, we're great contributors to the think tanks and to the political discourse and funding and everything else. But the reality is, we are not in states where we make a difference. Now, I don't know if that's a macro problem that you can deal with or not. So I think among the challenges, I had the great privilege of working all over the world. So I've been a professional diaspora person. I joined Citi in India. I worked in Hong Kong. I worked in Europe, in Brussels. I worked in Latin America. I worked in New York. And there's a significant Indian diaspora in each of those places, Bombay included. But the things that you see about them are really quite interesting. I mean, I think it's extremely successful, striving in every case, fairly closed and tightly knit, and very often reflects the culture and the mores of the time when they left India. So if you think of the diaspora, really it's like a geological formation. They're strata of people who think and act and behave in different ways, depending on when they came. And you can see it even in the US, but more notably in Europe and in the UK. So working with them, I think, is really great fun and a real challenge. I've been involved in two organizations, the American India Foundation and the IIT Bombay Heritage Fund, the precursor of a lot of the IIT funds, which have been extremely successful in raising money for projects in India, social projects and educational projects in India. And really the openness and the generosity of the diaspora is something quite phenomenal. And I do think that the connection is there, and I do think it's important that that connection be maintained. So what do we need to do? I think cultural bandwidth is important, broadening of vision, that we get more locally involved, local connectivity. One of the great fears is looking at what happened to the Indian community in Africa, which did not, in fact, develop roots and connections, and found itself very wealthy, but ultimately marginalized. I also think the thing that we have to worry about is the next generation. Most people have come in with a strong educational background, with, again, the striving effort, and made a name for themselves and done extremely well. It's not clear to me that the next generation, particularly in today's economic environment, has the same opportunities. So while I think we can celebrate ourselves, there's a lot we ought to think about how we manage going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And now Kapil Sharma with his extensive experience with Tata Sons across the world.
Thank you. This stinks for me because I'm going last and following, three very good people and covering most of the issues. I want to first of all thank all of you for listening to me speak on a Saturday afternoon in Boston. Boston is a very weird city for me. I'm born and raised in New Jersey. I'm a New York Jets fan, and so when I come to Boston, I'm surrounded by Patriots fans. So it's a little tough, but I'm feeling better now because Boston gave me half of the LA Dodgers, so we've picked up a lot of the Boston Red Sox salary. So I'm feeling okay about Boston for now. You know, I'm going to talk about, I think, a new entrant in the diaspora, and my role as the chief representative, chief spokesman for the Tata Group in North America. I get to work with our 10 companies that are all over the United States. We have 24,000 employees, and we're doing about $8 billion in revenue. And we're doing a lot of interesting and incredible things, and they all play a role in the way that I think people will view the U.S.-India relationship. My bio is in the pamphlet, but I started working on U.S.-India relations, and I'm going to be dating myself because I usually get away with it with a bald head. But I started working on this 21 years ago in the U.S. Congress when I started the India caucus for a congressman called Frank Pallone. And the caucus was started back then because there was this new emerging diaspora where there was a community that was growing, and there was tremendous interest in being politically active. And at that time, it was for the senior people in the audience. You've heard of this name of Congressman Stephen Solars. He tended to be the champion of the community. But he had lost his re-election bid to Nydia Velasquez, and there was a vacuum. Congressman Pallone had this small town called Edison, which has a few Indian people living there. And we decided then, you know what, it's best to maybe start representing the diaspora needs. Now, that was 20 years ago. And the fascinating thing is how much the relationship has changed, and I think Ambassador Singh has covered it well. What were we talking about 20 years ago? We were talking about glass ceilings. We were talking about immigration and family reunification. We were talking about Kashmir. We were talking about Pandit's Khalistan and nuclear war with Pakistan. Those were the dominant issues. 10 years later, what are we talking about? We're talking about the importance of India. And we're talking about the need to lift sanctions because of the nuclear test. Because if we don't lift the sanctions, it could ruin relations with a strategic partner. Then a couple of years after that, we're talking about opening up India even more so U.S. companies can invest in India. And now what are the new issues that we're talking about? We're talking about Indian companies coming to the United States. And I think that is a new entrant into the diaspora discussion. And why is that? Well, Ambassador Singh touched upon it, that India is one of the fastest growing investors in the United States. It's growing at approximately 41% per year. And so if you look at that over a 5-year period, we're talking last year's numbers of $9 billion of Indian investment in the US. So why does that matter to all of us? Well, that's employment. Because now you're having Indian companies employing Americans. And Americans are now finding new and different ways of touching India. It's not no more the doctor, the hotel owner, the Dunkin' Donuts owner, the 7-Eleven now. It's now big multinationals coming in and employing your dad, your brother, and your sister. And you're bringing Indian managers to come in. Or you're taking companies, and since I work for the Tatas, I'm only going to talk about the Tatas. Sorry, Mr. Godrej. But you have TCS. TCS works and does IT support in Kansas City. You have Indian engineers who are working in small towns in Kansas who are interacting with locals. Now, get beyond the outsourcing issue, but there's that human connection. And when you're working side by side with people who may have never had a contact with India, and the only impression of India they get is through the New York Times or Washington Post, which likes to show poverty, religious violence, or burning nano, that's their only impressions of India. So it's these employees that come from Indian companies that interact with these people and actually say, you know what? These people are not out to destroy our country. They're not out to steal our jobs. They're just like me and you. They just want to survive. And this is such an interesting dynamic in the diaspora and the relationship, and it's just emerging, that I think that we only have great places to go. So I would love to engage, and I think Mr. Menezes did a great job of talking about the other group of people in our community, something that Sonal and I have fought long and hard for over the years. I'm not going to date her as long as she's been doing it, but I know her, so it gives you a little bit of an idea of how long she's been working on these issues. there is a lot of new interesting issues. The diaspora is changing. The roles of companies in this diaspora is changing, and I'd love to engage more about it during Q&A.
Thank you, Kapil. Ambassador Singh, would you like to say something on this? Yeah, okay. Now that we've had a 35K view of the engagement of the diaspora, both in the US-India relations and in the corporate sectors, it would be great to hear from this panel their views on the, starting with the diaspora and the political and social landscape in the US. Kapil, you can start first. This time you were last time.
I get asked this question a lot because I've been working in politics for 21 years. I think the interesting question that our community has to ask is there a political diaspora? And not to confuse cultural diaspora with a political diaspora. And the reason why I raise this question, and I'd love to hear from the other panelists and from the audience as well, is do we have a political agenda in this country as a community? And it goes to a little bit to what Mr. Menezes was talking about, which is what are the issues that really bind us, politically speaking? And I'm suspect as to whether those issues currently exist anymore. I think that for our communities, that a lot of the issues that dominate our community, the diaspora here, are more locally based. So Boston Indians are going to have different views than Atlanta Indians. They're just going to have different issues that are confronting them. And so does that mean that their influence in elections and politics as a community wane? The other question that gets asked a lot is, do we need Indian Americans to be elected? And I kind of take the view that we don't. I know it's a controversial viewpoint. I get yelled at a lot about it. But the reason why I feel that way is that what we do is when we have Indian Americans elected, what we as a community have a tendency to do is to dump all our issues on that one particular person. So Bobby Jindal gets elected as governor. What's the first thing that people complain about Bobby Jindal? He's not Indian enough. So why is that? Why are we complaining that he's not Indian enough? He's governor of Louisiana. We should say, is he Louisiana enough? Is he representing his constituents enough? And we as a community need to focus more about who is representing us here and now versus always worrying about, are we going to get an Indian in Congress to represent, because an Indian in Congress cannot represent the entire community and the entire diaspora. It's just not possible. So I almost say we have to tame our expectations as to what we want politically and what we want for the diaspora.
Well, that's a challenge of the fabric that we have. We are quite a pluralistic society. So that's something that we'll have to deal with. Sonal, your views on it?
You know, it's funny. Cap and I have been around for so long that I think our views merge at some point. But, you know, let's separate a couple of things. One is kind of actual political engagement and the being in politics, running for office in the political and social sector with activation in the political and social sectors. And I'll talk a little bit about how many people are actually in the political realm. When we talk about people working for congressmen or senators, when we talk about people working at the White House, both in Republican and Democratic administrations, when we talk about people leading philanthropies, people leading national think tanks, it's amazing how much influence we actually do have and how much we think we actually don't have. Half the time we spend worrying that we don't have enough influence, and we don't actually think about the places where we do have influence and how to leverage that influence most effectively. So I think Cap hit it right, which is we tend to also talk about our politics very internationally. So what is our relationship with India as a diaspora versus what are our interests in the United States of what we need on the education front, on the healthcare front? We rarely ever engage on education, yet most of our kids go to public schools. It's fascinating how few people actually run for school boards or city councils, where those issues are actually the most important set of issues that I think for us, and I'm one of the people that have benefited from a public education, we rarely participate in that. Or public universities, whether it's Rutgers, whether it's University of Texas, University of California, Berkeley, the California system. We don't actually think about the systems as public education and how much we don't actually engage in any of those in the political basis. So, but there are people that run universities. There are people that run business schools. I mean, look just even at Harvard Business School is run by Nitin Noria. and he's the dean of the business school. So when you think about power in the social and political sectors, we're actually in many of these places. The question I think we have to ask ourselves is, what does that power mean, and what do we want it to mean? I just kind of say that I think we have to separate sometimes the politics of being elected versus the politics of power, and those are very different things. And also remembering, and I think as Mr. Menezes actually put it very clearly, is we represent, and if we want to represent just the wealthy and very successful part of our diaspora, that's great. But there is a very large portion. The immigration over the last 20 years has been very different from immigration from 20 to 30 years ago, which was a highly educated group of people that were brought here. The next generation of immigrants are not necessarily the highly educated. And the second and third generations are not achieving the levels of education of their parents and grandparents. So remembering where those statistics are going and thinking about what it is we want to represent and how we want to represent it is actually pretty important. And education is probably one of the most important places where all of this comes together. We don't actually engage on public universities and how much tuition rises have increased. $50,000 to $60,000 a year to send a child to school puts a lot of people off of the university system. Many of them, and including in our diaspora, go to community colleges. Yet we don't even talk about community colleges. We don't engage in the community college system and the importance of the community college system and the politics of that. $20 billion got spent on, is going into community colleges. We don't even engage in that part of it in our communities. So I think going back to Cap's point, look sometimes local, don't always look at national and international, because the power that we have at local levels also begins to demonstrate the power we have at the international level. People want to know our views on India if we engage at the local levels. People want to know what I think about India, not because I talk about India at the White House, but because I'm successful at what I do in the White House about the issues that I cared about. Then they want to know, well, if you're successful in this, maybe you have some successful ideas. You all face it already, whether you're in, if you're running your own companies and you're successful, then people want to know what you think about India. But they want to know first that you can run a successful company, or you're a successful scientist, or you're successful in the things that you do. The same holds in the political and social sectors. It's not just about what we project, it's about what we do also. And I think sometimes we don't think about the things that we do and how much we can project based on that.
Thank you, Sonal. Victor.
Just to change the topic a little bit, I think one of the areas that the diaspora can play a much bigger role politically in is in India. I think the Indian system is much more open to ideas than we give it credit for, and is really looking for thoughts and examples, and I do believe there's a role to be played there. I mean, most major events, including the freedom movement in India, were done by NRIs in modern India. And it's a country that, in fact, is open to, and not to be lectured, but if you take the trouble of understanding the system and can be part of the system, the amount of leverage and help that can be there is significant. I think that's something that we should really think about because there is a role to be played. I mean, it's not just lecturing from above, but how do you get involved and how do you get active?
Any thoughts about this?
Just, of course, being the representative of a foreign government in the US context, I have to be very careful and not comment about politics and political approaches in this society. But purely as an outside observer, one, it is clear that the Indian American community here is getting more involved in fundraising activity, and we are seeing that. Also, for example, the House India Caucus and the Senate India Caucus, they are the largest caucuses in the House and the Senate for any country. And part of the reason is it's not just the India Caucus, it's called the Caucus on India and the Indian Americans. And so clearly there is a recognition of the importance of this political constituency for members of the House and the Senate. And just elaborating on a point that both Victor and Sonal made, that obviously there's a spread within the levels of attainment for the diaspora here, that the same study that I referred to has also found that the median income in the generation born here is lower than the median income in the generation that has come from India. And also the level of educational achievement in terms of degrees of the generation born here is lower than the generation that came from India. So obviously there are issues here that need to be discussed and looked at.
However, on the positive side of this question, I think we all know that we have two governors of Indian origin, in Louisiana and in South Carolina.
And I would be remiss if I didn't say that the Indian based companies are also developing their own political agenda here. And very much so, we've been forced to deal with that, independent of the community, mainly because of the views of outsourcing, immigration, H-1B, L-1 relocation, Buy America provisions, and at times where Indian companies are blamed for a lot of the economic ills that are taking place. Already, tomorrow, Ambassador and I were just talking about how 60 Minutes is going to be talking about Chinese investment in the United States. And so something that we are learning to do is to develop a political identity for Indian corporates and what they're doing in the United States so we can stem a lot of this backlash towards India and China when it comes to investing.
Well, that is a very important issue, and I'd just like to come in here saying that, the Indian corporate sector has been doing a lot of investment. You talked about a figure of 41 billion last year and the number of jobs that have been created. That's something we've all been, doing our very best to keep it as an advocacy model. Having said that, I'd also like to share with the audience the two things. Number one is that you've got 5 Indian Americans running for the Congress this year, and it'll always be a matter of pride to have some of them in the Congress. And secondly, about the issue that we talked about, the Indian diaspora in the Indian politics scenes. We do have somebody who was a diaspora from here being elected as a member of parliament from Hyderabad. Madhu Gaudiyaskri was somebody running a company here, and he's a member of parliament in India. So there is a lot of integration, both sides. Now, the most important thing, I think, which has been really highlighted as far as the Indian diaspora is concerned, has been their successes in the Silicon Valley and the innovation. And here again, all 3 of my friends here have extensive experience. So without much ado, I'd like to ask Victor to start about innovation and co-creation, and then move on to the other side.
I think I spent most of my life in a big multinational global bank. And the reality was that there's no corner of the world that has a corner on innovation. And most of our innovation took place around the world. And a fair amount of that took place in India itself. So if you have the combination of bright people, at that time, difficult infrastructure and regulations, you also developed a lot of creativity. So actually, quite a lot of the banking product innovation or system innovation came out of India, came out of Asia, came out of different parts of the world. And I think, again, as a diaspora, being able to live between and across many countries, it's incredibly powerful, the amount of innovation that can come out of that. So that's why I think this issue of cultural bandwidth and being linked is very important. With the combination, I think, of the technical expertise in the community and just the track record of the last 20, 30 years has been fantastic. And it's just not innovation for innovation's sake, it's innovation that have created new industries and employed thousands of people.
Thank you, Victor. I mean, here I must just come in while we've been talking about Tata Sons over here. Citigroup's been in India since 1902, much before we were ever opened for the foreign companies. Okay, couple.
Innovation is a great buzzword, and for the Tata Group, we look at innovation in probably 2 or 3 different ways. And investing in the United States has allowed us to learn and innovate. I would say that's helped us both here in the United States and India. We have Mr. Godrej in the audience, and he can talk about great innovations that his company is doing as well. But in the United States, for example, what kind of innovation is taking place? You have product innovation primarily. A lot of great products are coming, and we recognize that. What kind of innovation is happening in India? It's more services and process innovation. How do you get a product to as many people as possible? And there are tons of great stories about that. So we as a Tata Group, as we continue to invest in the United States, we look at it and say, okay, how do you take incredible product innovation from the United States and marry it with Indian process innovation? And how do you create a better product and get that product, scale it up and get it to as many people as possible? But the more interesting thing is, why does we have to limit that to both India and the United States? Why can't we take that to Africa and Latin America? And that's what I mean by the diaspora, because we just developed a $20,000 electric car. Now, that car was developed by Detroit engineers, supported by our engineers in Pune. That's innovation, that's collaboration, and that's ability to produce a product. And I think you're going to see more and more of this innovation take place, where you're going to have the best of India, the best of the United States. Now, again, I'm going to throw one red flag, because I will be political, is that opportunity for collaboration and innovation is being threatened by very xenophobic people in the administration, and sorry about that, but that's how I feel. Because if you prevent the movement of people, because innovation is about people getting together. MIT is a great place for innovation because people can innovate here. But if you have policies that don't allow people to get together and to collaborate, that ability to innovate gets threatened. And so for us, it's very important to ensure that people can move. A global company like the Tata Group has to be able to move its best and brightest around the world. If we can't do that, we can't innovate. And so it's great to talk about innovation, but you got to also be able to protect the atmosphere to innovate.
Thanks, Kapil. Sonal.
I don't know that we need to repeat kind of everything that's been said, because I would agree with it. I think I would say it's important. I think one of the challenges that we face as a society in general is, in many ways, everything has become global. So processes have become global, corporations have become global. There's lots of global stuff, yet we still operate in nation-state structures. And so immigration is probably the #1 place where we see this playing out most effectively, which is how do people and ideas move across global boundaries. And we haven't yet figured out, we've innovated technology and we've certainly opened up the process of getting information to people, but we haven't yet figured out how to collaborate effectively, in which you cross global IP lines, you cross global state boundaries that you have. And that, I think, is going to be a place where I would say corporations certainly have a big role to play in thinking about how those global structures get created amongst nation states. India has the same problem as the United States, which is how do those lines blur in allowing you for more of that to happen, and how do we make that happen? And this is where I think the diaspora can also play a very important role in thinking about how those policies actually start changing. It's not just about going to your congressman and saying, you need to open up the visa process. It's really thinking about how do you allow for innovation, technological innovation to take place. And what's fascinating to me is it's no longer a one-way street. Before it used to be products developed here, sold in other countries. Now it's really sometimes products developed elsewhere, thinking about how you can integrate them back into the United States. One of them, is water technologies. Clean water technologies actually in India is where most of the interesting clean water, low-cost technologies are coming, and GE and others are going there trying to figure out how they can buy those up. Similarly with healthcare, low-cost healthcare technologies are actually built mostly in India, but that's where people are going to get those ideas. So the boundaries have changed. The question is, how are the processes and policies going to change in allowing that to happen? And then finally, when we think about innovation, it's funny because it's become the buzzword, innovation and entrepreneurship, yet it's been happening for generations. When we think about the sciences, when we think about pharmaceuticals, when we think about physics, chemistry, all those innovations, and many of them have been by the diaspora coming here or coming to other countries and developing kind of new processes, new technologies. And right now, Silicon Valley is the hot thing to talk about, so we talk about the innovations in Silicon Valley. But those innovations, whether it's even in the financial services industries, many of them have been part of where the diaspora has been involved. The question is, how do we recognize it and know that this has been happening, and now think about it in a global structure of how do we allow this to cross boundaries? So it's not just about innovation and entrepreneurship, but the co-creation can actually happen across boundaries.
That just goes around proving one point that, we no longer have any country boundaries, and we have economic boundaries which really bind the global diaspora together. I've just been reminded we are going to be running short of time for questions, so let's throw it open for questions from the audience. Sorry, would you like to say something?
Ambassador, could you kindly give us the reference to the study you were referring to, the study from which you took the numbers?
It's not a public document as yet, but it's soon going to be a public document. It's done by Center of Advanced Study of India at UPenn. So soon it will be public. So.
Thank you. And the question is both for Mr. Sharma and Sonal, and that is, what do you think of a number of candidates running for Congress this time around, including in in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, Assemblyman Chivukula and so on. What do you think are their prospects, and what are they doing right in terms of the Institute of Politics analysis of it, and what are they doing right, what they're doing wrong, and what are the prospects? And generally speaking, are the corporates like the Indian Doctors Association, physicians, the Hotel Motels Association, are they getting linked to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and their own American associations, and how are they getting linked to the bigger enchilada, so to speak, instead of their own Indian organizations, which are important in themselves? Thank you.
So, politics is interesting. Politics is very local. Wherever you're running, especially when you're running for congressional offices, it is about the number of doors you knock on. Most people win by less than 1,000 votes at very local levels. So in many ways, I think we think about politics as going out there and getting elected. The fundraising is one very important part of it, and it's a question of how well you do on the fundraising, but the second part of it is how many people do you get out to come out and vote for you. And I think sometimes one of the things that we forget as Indians, and I've had many friends who've run at very local offices, is we forget building the infrastructure of people knocking on doors. If you just think about the Obama campaign, and the Romney campaign's doing very similar things, the number one thing that they did in 2008 was they had people in city blocks capturing information of how many people were going to vote block by block, community by community, and knocking on that many doors every single day. They had knocked on that many more doors the next day. They knocked on that many more doors the third day. And it's important to remember how much of politics is very local. So I think one of the things I would say to our candidates is focus on the fundraising. That's one part of it. But also focus on building your infrastructure that allows you to get out more people to vote. And that part I don't think we have done very well, to be honest. I think Bobby Jindal did it well. I think Nikki Haley did it well. I think, what's his name in Maryland? Maryland, Kumar Bharve does it well. But they've figured that piece of it out. And that, I think, as a community, we have to think about building that infrastructure and helping them build that infrastructure to allow them to then go out and get that many more votes. But it is very local. How much do you represent your community? Bobby Jindal's success does not depend on what the Indian American community thinks about him. Bobby Jindal's success is all about Louisiana. How well did he do in the last hurricane? How well did he do in the economic crisis? Those are the questions that people ask of him, and that's something that we need to remember, that if we want to be a part of that dialogue, we need to be a part of that. So as candidates, I would say remember that, because I can't tell you how many candidates that I've supported that didn't think about the local aspect of it. They were living somewhere else, went back to their community and ran for office. That's not the same thing as knowing people, going to the community events, being a part of that community, and frankly, getting 5,000 more people out to vote. It's almost that important. As to your second question around AHOA and API, and I think Cap probably has a better answer to this than I do, but I think they're beginning to. I mean, to give them credit, they built an organization that's actually very successful, AHOA and API, and now they're very well integrated into, at least in API, integrated into the American Medical Association, and are actually participating in parts of those conversations. I think as a group of the medical doctors, I think when it came to the healthcare bill, they didn't represent that perspective of like what small businesses aspect of it. But what happened is, I think there was a part of not liking the policies, but not knowing how to integrate into those policies. But I don't think that was just API's fault. I think that was, in general, the American Medical Association took certain stances, and how they should have played that out could be played differently. But I think they're beginning to do that, and I think I would recommend, AHOA has actually done a very nice job of kind of rethinking how they integrate into those policies. I don't know them as well personally as I think CAP does, but I think those are, they're beginning. It's a start, and remember, we're a diaspora that's young. When we think about it, our diaspora has been growing over the last 40 years. Many other diasporas have been here for many years, many more years than us. So we're beginning to get there, but it's going to take time.
I hate following Sonal because she's extremely articulate, and that's why she's a professor at Harvard and I'm not. Yeah, just briefly, one of the things that I think Upendra has done right, and he's an old friend, I've known him, he actually helped me start the India Caucus when he was an engineer at AT&T, is that what Upendra, Kumar, and Bobby have shown is that Indian Americans can actually lead people. and they can lead a widespread of people, whether you're black, white, Hispanic. And I think that's the beauty of what they've done. And to show that you have that leadership capability is important in taking the next step. We have a tendency as a community to go right for the top job right away. That's kind of like, you know, you're not successful if you're not a congressman right away. But you know, we've had tremendous success at the state level, and I think it's because we've been able to show our commitment to those communities. And I think I'm a big believer that if you're going to run for higher office, you need to start small first and then move up. I'm not going to talk about API and AHOA, but I think chambers provide a problem for Indian companies at times. That's why we're members, we work with FICCI and we work with CII, because what we're finding now is we're finding competition with American-based companies for a number of things. The number one issue is talent. You know, there's such a talent shortage in this country. Everybody is fighting for that talent. And that's why, you know what, I'm taking resumes from MIT before the Googles and the other Facebooks come around. But, you know, and what happens is that people use chambers as a way of maybe pushing a political agenda. You know, this is a public document, and I feel like I can talk about it, although I haven't cleared it with my bosses, but I'm going to still talk about it, is that Microsoft, for example, has put out a report talking about STEM education, and they feel that H-1B visa fees should go up from $2,500 to $15,000. Now, that's okay if you're Microsoft. You can afford a $15,000 per application fee. But that's going to take out a lot of other companies who won't be able to afford that. That's a talent grab. Now, what are they doing that through? They're doing that through chambers. I can tell you one thing. I try to dispel any myths about outsourcing. I don't see many American chambers of commerce talking about outsourcing. And now it's important to us. FICCI carries it. CII carries it. Ambassador Singh carries it. But American-based chambers don't. So I kind of find a way, we want to be part of the American solution. Problem is we have to convince people to let them know that we are part of that solution and we're not part of the problem.
I just saddened here that only once in the last 7 years that we've been bringing out that study on investing in America, we had the US Chamber of Commerce partner with us. And they did it 1 year, and after that they were told to lay off. Some questions out there.
Hi, can you hear me? Is the problem of reverse brain drain still sort of acknowledged given the uncertain economy? And this might be pertinent to the ambassador, but others, please feel free to weigh in and how what's changing out there given that we have the elections coming up.
What do you mean by reverse brain drain?
Well, there was this concern late in 2008, 2009. Well, it's been an ongoing concern about especially engineers and scientists going back to India because of favorable conditions there, and that, you know, given the shortage that we have of well-qualified STEM-educated people here, is there any policy being sort of enacted? And I know that we may have touched upon some of these things earlier, but with regards to that issue particularly.
Okay, well, if you're talking about doctors and engineers going back to India to find opportunity there, now, of course, it's for each individual to decide, but from India's point of view, that's a welcome development. Because earlier, the problem was that people were educated in India, and as many of you would know, education in India is extremely cheap. I don't know how much Victor paid, but when I was studying, I was paying 50 cents per month as tuition fees. And I was one of the better liberal arts colleges in India. And I think at IITs and other places, they paid similar amounts. And with that subsidy in education, highly qualified people then came and worked in the US because they got better opportunity here. And in fact, the reason why the level of qualification among the first generation is higher, because that's the kind of education they got, and they came here and earned very well here. And so certainly there was concern in India at that stage, at that happening. But again, we have found that people who have gone back from US to India have, many of them, contributed to building India-US partnerships. Now, for example, in the IT sector, some of the expansion of the relationship has been brought about by people who went back from US to India and then built up companies that are exporting to the US or contributing to solutions in the US, contributing to profitability in the US. or in doctors. Many doctors have worked here, gone back, and have built very good hospitals in India. So now I think in the new world, rather than brain drain, people are looking at what they call brain circulation. People work for a while in India, work for a while in the US. Many people now have presence both here and in India. You don't have to be at one place. You can do work at both places. So I think it's a new situation. People choose for their convenience and well-being. There was a reference in the earlier session to well-being and happiness and surrounding to where they want to stay. And wherever they are, I think given today's technology and communication, they can contribute in more than one place.
Yes, I got a fairly inexpensive education at IIT, but I also went back right after MIT, which was unusual at that point, and worked for the first 10 years of my career in India, in Calcutta, in Delhi, in Bombay, and it was the best thing I did. I think the opportunity to learn and to grow that you get in India in dealing with all of the challenges that exist is a fantastic learning opportunity. And to any of you who are thinking about it, I think it's something seriously worth considering. So I do believe in the brain circulation.
There's a question here.
So Kapil, you talked about the fact that there are no Indian issues for Indians living in the US who care about things like education, whether it's public schools or universities. You're a first generation, I presume a first generation American, Indian American. What makes you care about India?
That's actually one of probably the hardest panel questions I've ever been asked. I'll take that back. I don't say that there are no issues. There are definitely foreign policy issues that a lot of first-generation Indian Americans care about. My fear is that that interest, and Sonal was talking about the second and third generation, it's waning. Now, I have two small children, 7 and 3. We lived in India, and so my 7-year-old still remembers India. I don't know how long I can keep that up unless I keep visiting India. My 3-year-old has no clue what India was like. And so what's going to end up happening is that that love for India is going to really come through a cultural love, not necessarily a political love. And when we talk about education, and Sonal was extremely articulate about it, it's not Indian per se, right? Our concerns about public education are what all Americans care about. And that's my concern, is that a lot of our issues for second and third generation are just going to morph into the general concern. My love for India comes mainly because I was exposed to it at a very early age. When I started the caucus, I was 18 years old, and so I was still, I didn't know what I was doing with my life, and I met impressive diplomats from India who really just exposed me to India. I was probably as coconut can get. Growing up, because my parents had faced a lot of discrimination when they moved here. So actually they took the opposite. They said, be as American as possible, so you don't face the struggles that we did. And it's people like Arun Singh and his colleagues and others that drew me in. And I can't explain it. It's something one cannot explain. And then we lived in India, and I came back even stronger, and Ambassador Singh knows that.
If I could just comment on that, again, as an outsider, because I interact with people here and I see responses. And one of the things that I found that very often, as Kapil mentioned, when they're at school, the children integrate or try to integrate very much more. But very often when they reach universities, I find at that level there is a search for a certain Indian-linked identity and cultural or whatever. So that is there. So there is a consciousness that very often emerges at that level. Second, as we expand India-US cooperation, there will be opportunities for an Indian American where they will have advantages compared to a person who is not an Indian American. And I think, so that again will give us options to build opportunities, partnerships, interests.
Thank you. I know there's a lot more questions in the audience, but we need to
Wind up.
So let me just thank all the panelists for such a great session here. We learned about the ways that we could all contribute, and we are in the diaspora as well, and as students, as professionals, how we can contribute, and especially Ambassador Arun Singh pointing out that there is a forum for us that we can actually ask for help or give help, and which was a very interesting thing for us. So we have some tokens of appreciation for such a great panel. Please accept MIT's. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.